visual novel is coming along nicely, and we've got a lot of things in place. We've got our logs set up, and we're able to recall states that we have previously passed by going back through our history states. Now, we're moving on to the next topic. After we've gone through all of our characters and all the things building up to this point, now it's time to save our progress and save everything that we have seen, that the player has seen and done, into a visual novel save file that they can load from the main menu and resume their progress at a later time. No one wants to have to finish a long story in one sitting. Well, some people do, but most people don't. It's not efficient, it's not practical. So we'll be implementing the save system that so many visual novels use right now. This save system is seen through a save and load menu where we can load our progress and save everything that was related to a particular instance in time and go right back to it. So the way that this works is like this. We take our visual novel and we decide that we have reached a point and maybe we need to leave or we need to do something and we just want to save our progress. So we click the save button. Maybe we choose a slot to save to, but we need to save all of our information to a file. So we're going to take the current state and we're going to copy a whole bunch of information into a single file, and that is our visual novel save file. The first thing that we want is any standalone values. These are values that are not located in the variable store or located in other places, but they are specific to the particular save file that we're working with. And these would be values that are saved inside of our save file class, so they'd be easy and accessible there. But it'd be things like our player name, because that would be different for every file, and even our slot number. So if we're using a save and load system with a menu, and you have different slots, maybe 1 through 99, and you can navigate between those slots to choose the file you want to save or load to, then that would need to be indicated here as well. So different values related to our save files, we need to make sure that we have those written down so we can recall them. And we also want to make sure that we save the current screen configuration. We need everything on screen to be restored when we recall this load. And we can already do that with our history states. So we just need to save the most current history state by capturing it and writing it to file. Now, we've also got a list of all the other history states that we've been going through, so if we want to be able to look at those when we reload the file, we need to save our history log with all of the cached history states in it. The next thing that we'll want is runtime variables. So these are things that are declared inside of your dialog files, such as the variables that you can make with our variable store system. You can define a variable and you can use those variables and conditions and checks inside of your dialog file. But if you were to save your file in between where a variable is instantiated and when the variable is used in a condition check, then if we don't write the variable to memory, then it's going to mess up your dialog file. So we need to make sure that we save all that is in our variable store to our file. Next, we also want to save the story progress, like what chapter the character is on when or the player is on when they saved, and what progress they were at. So how far in the file were they? Now, it's not as simple as just writing the name of the file and the line that we stopped on to disk, because we have a little more of a complicated system. So if we had a much simpler setup, we could do that and we could get away with it quite easily. But since we're using choices and we're using if-else logic, and we have lines that may execute under certain conditions and other lines that will be skipped under different conditions, we need to save each individual conversation that's been stacked in our queue and the progress for each one of those. Now, in order to save on memory, we won't be saving all of the lines of the files. That would just be a waste of space. Instead, we will be saving a reference to the file name, which the conversation belongs to, but we'll also be saving the progress for each of those individual conversations. So what line number they started on, what line number they end on, and how far in between the character was when they were in that conversation. If we don't do that, then our system will just pick up at maybe whatever line we left off at, but it won't know what lines that it needs to omit and which ones that it actually needs to continue on reading. So we need to save every one of our conversations, what file it was loaded from, and the progress of it. That way we can reload everything perfectly. We'll also want a preview screenshot. So when the player saves their game, we want a screenshot to be taken. And we kind of set this up with our main and overlay canvases that we did in the beginning of the series. We'll make use of that in this system. So we'll save the screenshot, and that will be what is displayed on the slot where this save file is located. And when you go through that menu, you'll be able to see the file, the progress, as well as a little screenshot. And then any other data that needs to be saved, whatever that may be, if you think of anything, then you want to make sure that if it's important to your visual novel, you save it inside of this file. Once we've got all that information, everything is going to be compiled into a single file, and that is our visual novel save file. So as we begin this system, the first thing that we're going to mess with is preparing our conversations to be saved in the system. And let's go ahead and take a look at this so that we're all on the same page as to why we need to make a small modification. As we all know, our dialogue files proceed sequentially, so we move line by line, and if we were to take a moment and just stop and save right here, we would save at progress 13 on file chapter1.txt. And then once we reload, instead of starting at line 1, we load up chapter1.txt and go back to line 13, and then we proceed sequentially and everything works great. Now this is perfect until we get to something like our logical line with a choice, because now we are interrupting the sequential process and we're going a completely different way. We're extracting particular lines and we're setting the progress of the initial conversation past this point to the next line outside of the extraction. So once we reach this point, a new conversation is generated, and now we are operating only on these 3 lines. We will no longer use these lines because we've made the choice to run these instead. So really what that does is it kind of changes our file to look like this, where we're now only running through these lines and we need to proceed sequentially once we've finished them. Problem is, once we've made that choice, if we were to save right here, we would save chapter1.txt at line 47. And when we go to reload it, we're going to go to line 47 and just proceed sequentially from there. We've completely forgotten that this was an extracted conversation. So we go 47, 48, 49, and then we go 50, 51, 52, 53, and you get the point. So instead of saving just the file name and the progress, we need to do it for every single conversation and then reapply them to the conversation queue so that way we get the right order for all the lines in our dialogue files, no matter what's going on. For us to do that, let's go to our core scripts inside of dialogue, and managers is where I saved conversation manager. I was anticipating possibly having a couple more things in here, but as it turns out, it's just conversation related stuff. So I'm going to change managers to conversations and just organize it in there. So let's find our conversation script. This is where we need to add some data. So the data that we want is, we want to save the file that this conversation was loaded from, as well as the start index and the end index for this conversation related to the file. So if we were to start the initial conversation, then we would save chapter1.txt as the file and the start index as, 0. As machine counting starts at 0, it's really line 1. So we'd go line 1 to line 61, which would actually be index 62. But when we do this new conversation, this one's the new priority conversation on top, and it's going to belong to chapter 1, and it's going to have a start index of 47, or really 46, and an end index of 49. So that's what we're looking for. So once we reload the conversation, we just reload the chapter file, and we extract the lines that are within the start and end indexes, and we've got our conversations back. Instead of saving the lines of the conversation, this allows us to save space by only referencing the name of the file and the integers rather than every single line. So we want to save as much space as we can. So to do this, let's go ahead and add a couple more fields. We're going to add a string for the file where this conversation was loaded from, so we know what file to reload. Next, we also want the file start index. That way we know where this conversation actually starts in the file it's loaded from. And of course, we also want the end index, so we know where the conversation actually ends in relation to the total file. So when we create this conversation, let's also pass in the ability to add these as parameters. So we'll have our string for the file, and let's just default it to an empty string for right now. Let's default these values so that way we don't really have to provide them. If we come across a conversation that doesn't have a file and it doesn't have a start index or an end index, such as if we add a very special conversation that might not be in one of our dialog files, I'm not sure what case we would use that in, but just in case we do, we'll have different ways to save our conversation. So we can have a compressed way, which saves the file and the start index, and we just load everything back from the file. Or we can save it in a full conversation format, which takes all of the lines, and those would be in special conditions where we have not loaded from a file, and we need to save the progress anyway. So that's why we're doing it optionally here. Next thing we want is the start index. So the file start index is going to equal -1. If it's -1, then we'll assume it's just going to equal the entire length of the conversation. And int file end index equals -1 as well. So let's go ahead and say this dot file equals file. And let's take a quick look and see what our start index and end index are. So if our file start index equals -1, then this needs to default to 0. So that way the start index is the very beginning of the conversation. And if our file end index equals -1, then we need to make sure that our file end index equals the conversation, or the lines rather, the lines dot count -1. So we're essentially saying if we don't provide any specific value, then just use the entire conversation, and it's basically like this whole conversation is its own file, so use everything in it. Once we're done with that, this file start equals start and end equals end. And we've got the information that we need to save for our conversations. Now that's great. But there are two things that we need to change after this, and that would be our two logical lines that create conversations. We know that is our choice, which creates a new conversation based off of the choice that we make to enqueue that as the new priority dialogue, and also the conditions, because it will extract everything from the if and else sections, and then run those, depending on if it's true or false, as different in priority conversations. So let's go to our logical lines in the types and open up both the choice and the condition. With those open, we also want another thing. We want to go to our logical line utilities, since this is responsible for ripping the encapsulated data. Let's go ahead and open up the utilities so that way we can tell it that this encapsulated section is a different part of a file, and we should maintain the starting and ending index for what we're ripping. So if we look at our choice here, as we go and create this new conversation, we're creating it just with a new selected line. So there's no file being passed in, and there's no index defining, letting us know whether this is the entire file or a segment of the file. So we need to make sure that we get that, but in order to do that, we need to get those numbers, the start and end index, from the encapsulated data. And this is coming from our logical line utilities. So we just need to go in here and add another variable to our parameters. That way we can define what the starting index is and find the correct range inside of our file to actually rip. As we do this, let's go to the very end of the parameters here and define a new parent starting index. The parent would be whatever conversation this may be a subpart of. So since we can rip conversations from other conversations, we'll want to take the starting index of whatever the parent conversation that this one's being ripped from and use that as the starting point for this conversation. That way, instead of getting the first line as index 0, we could get the first line as index 14 if it's index 14 in the file. So the way we're working right now is we get our choice and we go ahead and grab these lines, but we set the start index to 0 when it should be 47. If we define our parent, then we can go ahead and grab the right lines. So let's add another integer here. Integer for parent starting index. And that by default is going to equal 0. because we'll assume that a new conversation is coming from a new file, and we should take the entire file. So the start index would be 0, and the end would be whatever the end of the file is. So where we define our start index, we're actually going to set that equal to the starting index in addition to our parent starting index. And for our ending index, where we're setting it to I, if we're ripping from a different conversation that's already been pulled from the file, we just want to increment I by whatever the parent starting index was. Parent starting index, and there we are. We will have the right start and end index for our conversations, so that way they can be reloaded from the save file by ripping whatever lines fall within those indices from the actual file defined in the conversation. And so if we come back to our choice here, we can now fill in the parent starting index. So we can go ahead and say, after rip encapsulators and headers, we'll say that the parent starting index is equal to the current conversation dot file start index. So whatever the line is in the file where the current conversation starts at, we're going to start incrementing from there to find the lines of this new encapsulated data that's been ripped. And so the next thing that we need to do is we need to add these variables into our conversation. But we've just gotten the start and end index for the encapsulated data. We have not gotten it for the actual choices. For each choice, they're going to have their own start and end indexes, which define where they were ripped from in the file. So we need to come to get choices from data and make sure that we are saving the start and end index for every choice. Which means we just need to make sure that in our choice, we also include a start and end index that can be saved here. So public int start index and public int end index. Again, so for our encapsulated data, it will get the start and end index here. And for our choices, it will get the start and end indexes, so that way it will only identify the lines that belong to that choice. So when we get the choices from data using this function inside of llchoice, let's just make a way where we can save the start and end index for each choice now. So if we're going through indices, it would make sense if we don't use a for each loop anymore, but we instead use a for loop. So I'm going to comment that out real quick and say for, and we'll actually, for this loop, so that way we can reference it when we have to add the last choice as well, we'll have our integer defined outside of the for loop. So let's just make an integer for the choice index to equal 0, and an integer called I, which also equals 0. And we'll just reference I inside of the for loop. So I is going to equal 1, so that way we skip past the header, or skip past the header, and while I will start equaling 1, we proceed as long as I is less than the data.lines.count and increment I each time. So inside of this, let's grab our line as var line equals data.lines at whatever index we're working on right now. So now everything should really work the same. Just using a for loop, that way we can reference whatever index we're on right now. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what we'll do for our first choice. For every choice, let's make sure that we cache the choice index, so we know exactly where this one begins at. So choice index is just going to equal I, the current iteration of our loop. And for when we have a choice that we are now logging, when it's not the first choice, we know we've encountered a new one, so we can save the previous choice. So the previous choice that we're going to be saving, the one that we've just looped through and found all the lines for, it's going to be referenced as choice, and we'll just get the start index and set that equal to data. So data, which is our encapsulated data. The data already has the starting index, and we're going to add this by our choice index, where this choice began, plus 1. So that way we go past the actual choice title and we just get the lines. As for the end index, choice.end index is going to equal data.starting index plus whatever we are on right now, minus 1. So that way we don't go and grab the choice header from the one that we've just encountered. We're only ending at the line that preceded the choice that we've just found. Verbally, that doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense. I almost lose myself sometimes while I'm trying to explain these things. But visualization always helps. So let's just look at this and make sure we're all on the same page. We're getting the choice index as 46, let's say. And then we grab 47, 48, 49, and now we've hit 50. So we're grabbing the start index as choice index, which has previously been set to 46, add 1 to it, so the start index is 47. Now, take the choice index of 46, take us where we currently are, which is line 50, subtract 1, that takes us to 49. So this gets us only ripping the lines that belong to the choice and defining this as the start indexes. That way, when we go and reload this save file, we just go ahead and find that, hey, we were at a conversation here, we open up chapter 1 txt, and we rip lines 47, 48, and 49. And that's going to get us our choice data. But remember, we've got the last choice that's added because we don't have anything to terminate it at the end. So once we reach the end, we just need to add the choice that we've been working on that hasn't been added to the array yet. But we need to add a couple more lines for the start and end index, so let's encapsulate that. And before we add the choice, let's go ahead and say that I think I need to zoom in here. I'm not sure how small that is on y'all's screen. Okay, 154% is should be pretty visible. So let's get our start index for this choice. Our choice dot start index is going to equal data dot starting index plus, and this is why we define the variables outside of the loop, choice index, which was the starting point of our last choice, plus 1, so we get where the actual lines start. And choice dot end index equals data dot starting index plus I, which was our last iteration, which will actually end at the ending encapsulator. So instead of subtracting 1, we need to go past the ending encapsulator and subtract 2. This is because our loop is going to iterate all the way through, and it's going to hit this one, and it's going to then increment again and see, hey, we're now past, so we need to subtract 1 and subtract another to get to the last line that we saved. And there we go. That gets us our start and index for every choice. So as we go to execute and we go to create the new conversation, let's take advantage of these new parameters that we have to define the file that this conversation came from, as well as the start and end index for the choice that we've selected. So we'll say file is going to equal, since we're ripping from the previous conversation, if this came from another file, then the name of the file is going to be contained within that conversation. So our file will equal the current conversation.file. And our file start index is going to equal the selected choice.start index, and the file end index is going to equal the selected choice.end index. And that's good for our choices. So for our conditions, we need to do the same thing here. We need to make sure that we pass in the starting index for whatever conversation this is being ripped from into our encapsulated data. So after we define our current progress, and we say that we're not ripping the header and encapsulators, let's say that the parent starting index will equal the current conversation.file start index. And the same thing for if we get our else data. So let's go ahead and pass in at the end of this our current conversation.file. I think I need to specify the parameter. Parent starting index is the current conversation.file start. For some reason, it's not populating for me. I don't know why. Dot file start index. Oh, because it auto-completed current progress instead of current conversation. Okay, yeah, current conversation.file start index. So we'll do that for each time we rip the encapsulated data. And since we're not doing any other ripping like we did for the choice, we already have everything we need just by having the start and end index in our encapsulated data, because we're grabbing encapsulated data for both our if and our else segment, so it's already got the information we need. We just need to pass that into our new conversation. So our new conversation is going to have the file as the current, there it goes, doing that one again, conversation dot file. And our file start index is going to be the current conversation dot file start index, and the file end index will be the current conversation dot file end index. And there we go. That gets us all the information stored inside of our little conversations. Every conversation in our queue will have exactly what it needs, except for the very first conversation that's loaded from file, because we haven't passed in the file name that's being loaded yet. To do that, we just need to head to our testing script and make sure that we're doing that. Now, instead of loading my dialog files from the test script, since we're now getting into saving and loading, we're going to implement a new script that's going to handle this for us automatically. So this script is going to be controlling our visual novel, and it's going to tell us what should be the very starting file that's loaded on a new visual novel. And if we have a game that we're loading, it's going to go ahead and load it for us. And if we're trying to start a new conversation or load a new file, we're going to do it through the Visual Novel Manager. That way, it sets the values that we need. So inside of Core, let's make a new folder for our visual novel system. And for this, I'm going to make one script for the VN Manager. So I'll make a new file or object in the scene and call this the VN or Visual Novel Manager. And I'm going to move this to the very top of my hierarchy and just put the VN Manager script on it. My testing script, I'm going to go ahead and disable that now. Actually, no, I'm going to leave that active and we'll just use the two together for right now anyway. We'll have it take care of itself automatically in a minute, but let's go ahead and open up this script. So let's remove these functions here. We're not going to use them for right now. And let's make a new public void called load file. So we'll just take in a string for the file path, and this is what we're going to load. Basically, all we're doing here is we're making a centralized way to call a new dialog file that automatically puts the file path inside of the name. So, or inside of the conversation that's generated from it. So let's first of all, let's get all the lines that we can load from the file we're trying to read. So list string lines equals new list string, and we're going to grab our text asset from resources. So text asset file equals resources.load, and we'll load a text asset from the file path. So let's go ahead and try to read the file, and let's make sure that we catch any error just in case it doesn't happen, and we'll do nothing here. So inside of a try block, let's go ahead and say lines equals file manager dot read text asset, and let's pass in the file. And if for some reason that doesn't work, say that we passed in a bad file, then we'll go ahead and catch the error and just say debug.log error and tell us what happened. So I've got a little simple message saying that the dialog file at the path did not exist, and I'll go ahead and return and do nothing. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and reach out to the dialog system.instance and call the say method, which will take in the lines that we're going to say. But again, this will generate a conversation without the actual file path. So inside of our dialog system, we need to modify this so that way, when it creates the new conversation, it will also create it with the file path. So what we can do is we can make a string for the file path as a parameter and just make that empty right now so we don't have to provide one. But if we have it, we'll go ahead and say that file equals file path, and we know what we're trying to load here. which means when we call for this dialog file to be loaded and parsed in the system, we'll also pass in the file path as well. So let's come back to our testing script and open up the test dialog files. So what this has is it has given us a little text asset, which makes it real easy to load into the system. Problem is that on its own does not actually have a file path with it, so we wouldn't really know what to read here. So with this being a testing script, we're just going to go ahead and make it easy on ourselves and grab the asset path from that file. We won't be doing this for the visual novel, just the testing, because we'll be operating just off of file paths with our visual novel system. But for testing, let's go ahead and grab whatever path it is of this file we're trying to load. That way, instead of constantly changing this and adding different paths and retyping different things, it's just so much easier to paste in or move and drag and drop the text asset rather than a field. So full path equals, we're going to use the Unity Engine asset database for this, asset database.get asset path, and get the file to read. Once we've got that, let's go ahead and figure out, because this should be located in resources, so let's get the starting point of the resources part of this string, and we're just going to rip out resources from it. When we try to load something from resources, it automatically knows we're using resources, so we shouldn't have resources in the path that we're passing into resources, otherwise it'll give us an error. So let's just find out where resources occurs in this full path and remove it. Resources index equals full path dot index of, and we're going to get resources. That's what we're looking for. And let's convert our full path into a relative path inside of the resources folder by just removing resources. So string relative path equals full path dot substring, and we're going to start this at the resources index, so wherever it finds it, plus 10, because that's the length of this string. So we're just ripping it out. You could do replace, but I'm doing it this way just in case there are different resources folders, what have you. There might be subfolders, and I only want to remove the top one. Now let's get our new file path. So string file path equals the path. We want to remove the extension. This path is from the system.io namespace, so we need to use that up here. Using system.io. We can't load anything from resources if it has an extension on it. It's kind of weird, but we just have that limitation. So we need to make sure that we remove the extension. We can't remove it per se, but we can change it by taking our relative path and making sure that we replace whatever extension it has with nothing. And then we'll go ahead and remove these lines and just call for the conversation and the dialog file to be read using our Visual Novel Manager. So I'm going to go through and make an instance here, that way I can call it in my other scripts. So public static vn manager instance get private set, say void awake instance equals this, and inside of test dialog files, vn manager.instance.load file at the file path. And this will go ahead and pass in everything that we need for our conversation. So if I run that, I see absolutely no difference, which is great. That means nothing broke. So I can see that I can move through this visual novel, and let's go ahead and get to the choice here. Okay, here we go. We have our choice, so I should be able to select one. Let's head to the ship. Great, so it chooses the right dialogue, and then we go to the ship. All right, great. So everything looks good. And it should be adding in those file names and starting in indexes for everything, but we can't see that right now. So the way that we'll be able to see it is by going ahead and implementing it into our save file. I'm going to go ahead and stop this episode here because we've gone ahead and prepared everything that we need, so that way these conversations can be saved in the file. That's an episode in and of itself, so we will stop here. And in the next episode, we'll start defining our visual novel save file. All right, see you then.